the thumbs up when you come into the live stream. By hitting that thumbs up button, we're going to get more people to join in on the live stream, and it's always more fun to have more interesting questions down in the comment section. So today's live stream is going to be talking about the Fed funds rates and cutting interest rates, what that means. Like, I had somebody ask me this the other day. They're like, well, what does this really mean? And a lot of times I forget that people don't really study the economy like I do. Like I'm constantly doing research, reading articles, looking at, Fed document speeches. It's like a pretty constant thing that I'm doing. And so when it comes to thinking about the interest rates, cutting interest rates, what kind of impact that has on the economy, to me, it's just kind of a regular thing that's happening. I don't really think about what kind of impact. I just already thinking of it impacting the economy. So when somebody says, well, what does it mean when they cut rates? And I'm thinking, wow, okay, sure. I have to step it back. Like, I have to step it back and really explain things in a way that people have no clue about, right? In order to, and I'm not trying to say that the people I'm talking to out there are completely ignorant or something like that. They're not. It's just that this stuff isn't really talked about or described in a way that the average person is going to not only understand it, but retain it. So even if you're listening to the news, a lot of times they speak in a way that just, it'll just blast the information right past you. I know this is the way that I used to, look at the news. Is like, I'd be watching it and it'd be like, I understand the words, the definition of the words that they are using, but I just don't seem to comprehend what it is that they are trying to talk about. And so the more I started studying this stuff, the more I realized, okay, yes, they do kind of speak in a code. It's not code, it's just kind of this really unique way of using this lexicon in order to describe what it is that they're trying to convey when they speak. It's not code, but it is difficult to understand if you're not really, privy to what it is that they're trying to communicate in the first place. So understanding what it means when the Fed cuts rates, or what does cutting rates really mean, that is a very difficult question to answer inside of just a few seconds. Like, even just trying to describe it over the course of a minute would be also kind of difficult to understand, what it is that's taking place out there. So I'm going to try to explain what it is that's taking place when the Federal Reserve goes to cut rates, or when they just do interest rate adjustments in general, and what that really means for the economy, because things have evolved and changed over the last 10 years, even 20 years or so. But over the last 10 years, especially when it comes to how it is that the Federal Reserve is conducting their monetary policy, which is that adjustment of interest rates. So when we think, okay, so when they're cutting rates, what does that mean? Right? So like an individual who isn't really quite aware of the whole banking system, central banks, how the government interacts with it, all that other stuff, is going to listen to that and say, okay, they're going to cut rates, meaning mortgage rates, credit card rates, all the rates, so all the interest rates that are out there, they're going to cut these things. But that's not true. Like, that's not what they're adjusting. They're not adjusting the credit card rates or the mortgage rates or anything like that. Now, there is ways that they can adjust their balance sheet that would then manipulate the mortgage rates that are out there. But when it comes to interest rate adjustments, or the Fed funds rates, the monetary policy adjustments, it's really a key overnight lending rate that they're trying to deal with. And this is really important to understand. So we're going to step it back to the way they conduct themselves now to the way that they used to conduct themselves, because it's easier to understand how it is that they have evolved into the position that they are in today. So the way that the Federal Reserve used to conduct themselves, and it depends on how far back you really go with this story, but we're just going to kind of go back prior to the Great Financial Crisis. And prior to the Great Financial Crisis, the way the Federal Reserve would typically conduct themselves is with an overnight lending rate amongst the big banks. So you had the big banks, the JP Morgans, Goldman Sachs, all these people out there. They would have an overnight lending rate amongst them to meet a reserve requirement. So the way the central banking system, the Federal Reserve System, was set up is that these big banks had a reserve requirement in which, at the end of the day, they would have to have a certain amount of reserves on their balance sheet in order to operate for the next day. Now, at the end of the day, some of the banks would be in excess reserves and some of them would be in need of reserves. Now, what would end up happening is the ones who were in need of reserves would borrow them from the ones who had excess reserves. And this overnight lending rate, that was the effective fund rate. So this is the rate that they're trying to manipulate here, right? This overnight lending rate. Now, the way that they would manipulate that rate is by buying and selling treasuries off these big banks, adjusting the reserves levels within them. So if they have an excess amount of reserves, the interest rates would start to come down, as the overnight lending rate would also come down, due to the fact that everybody had available reserves to lend to those who are in need of reserves. But if they wanted the interest rates to rise, then they would do the exact opposite, and they would pull a bunch of reserves off these banks, which would then limit the amount of reserves that were out there. The demand for those reserves would then increase, which would then have the interest rates elevated. And so this is how the Federal Reserve would adjust interest rates back in the day, is with the overnight lending rate amongst these big banks. So hopefully you guys can understand that part so far. Again, like, most of the people who follow me on this channel know this information inside and out. But again, there's a lot of people who are trying to figure this stuff out for the first time, and it's important to understand how this works. Now, do realize this isn't the way that they do it now, right? But this is the way that they had conducted themselves for a very long time. So now it came to a point where they went into the great financial crisis. So I'm going to kind of simplify a lot of this stuff too. I'm going to skip over a lot of things, but just to kind of understand how it is that they are adjusting interest rates, they came to a point in which that they took those interest rates down to zero. Now, this was a very difficult position for the Federal Reserve to be in, because now it doesn't give them any ability to adjust rates if they are at zero. So now they would like to adjust interest rates in order to deal with the economy, especially when it came to unemployment, right? Because really, part of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, they have two positions: low and stable prices, or I'm sorry, low inflation with stable prices, right? Got to say that right. It's not low prices, it's low inflation with stable prices, and full employment. So now when the Federal Reserve would see that the unemployment would begin to rise, they would try to manipulate rates down through the overnight lending rate of these big banks. By bringing the rates down, corporations, companies, businesses out there would then borrow money to expand on their companies, and part of that borrowing the money and expanding on their companies was hiring people. So they could get the unemployment to come down by lowering the interest rates and sparking business investment. So this was important to kind of understand, because this is the way that the Fed would operate. And this is why so many people would get upset with the Federal Reserve as well, because in exact opposite of that, if the Federal Reserve saw that inflation was running too hot, what they would try to do is raise the interest rates to slow down on business investment, which would put a cap on hiring or even bring unemployment up, which would then slow the buying that was taking place, the consuming that was happening from all the employment. And then this would start to bring the inflationary pressures down. Of course, they don't want to say it like that, because, if they came out and told people, hey, we're going to try and increase or decrease the availability of jobs out there in order to deal with the inflationary scenario, people would lose their minds. So they talk about it in a way of consuming, right? And it was just like put a pressure on consuming, and say that, borrowing money to go out there and buy houses, cars, and go on vacation and stuff like that is the trigger for the economy when they are lowering interest rates. Like, this is what they're attempting to do. And I've said that myself, and actually that's somewhat disingenuous, right? That's not really what they are attempting to do. At least back then it wasn't. I should clarify that. Not at that time, because at that time what they would be looking for is not necessarily people to consume from the debt, but to consume from the employment that they got when the businesses went into hiring. That's where they would want to see the consumption taking place. As time evolved, it changed from that. Right? So again, it's important to understand how it is that they used to conduct themselves, so that we can move into how it is that they are operating today. So when we think about when the Federal Reserve was running to the great financial crisis, they knew that they were going to have issues with adjusting interest rates in order to stimulate the economy, because they would hit the lower bound of zero. Once they hit zero, that's it. Like, they're done, right? So if they were to go and adjust rates below zero, which theoretically it has taken place amongst economies out there, but there's no real theory or evidence out there that it could actually do well within an economy, like could operate at any kind of, how should I put this, like any kind of significance for any length of time. Like nobody's really operated in this sort of condition to know exactly what that would look like. Being in a cash society, it's also very difficult because people would start pulling a lot of money out in cash and then not participate in the banking system. So there's a lot of questions on whether or not they can get below zero on these things. So when the Federal Reserve goes into quantitative easing, which is the next step when they can no longer adjust interest rates, what they are doing is they're buying up these treasuries from the United States government. And so a lot of people would call this monetizing the debt. And it's not necessarily monetizing the debt because the Federal Reserve doesn't go and buy treasury debt directly from the treasury, these like government bonds. What they do is they buy those from the secondary market or from the market itself, right? Which is from the primary dealer. So it's already a purchased item. So it's like a secondary purchase, right? And so these treasury bonds, when you think about it, these are now all of a sudden in a position in which that they have a guaranteed buyer who has a printing press behind it. So you can imagine what kind of impact psychologically that has not only on the banking system, but the markets and everybody else out there, in that there's going to be like an inflationary scenario from all this massive money printing and forcing that into the government, into the government debt, which would then put the governments into this unsustainable debt path and all this other stuff. Well, the government goes out there and starts spending that money. So now we have to understand, like, what is it that was taking place here? Because see, there was a time in which that the Federal Reserve would lower rates, and then that would stimulate the economy, because people would go out there, borrow that money, not only to do the business investment to get hiring going, right? People would start, investing into their business and hiring a lot of people. And this all of a sudden would then bring a lot more income to the economy itself, and more purchasing or consuming that could take place from that extra hiring that was coming from the investment of the lowering of interest rates. I get all that right? Okay. And on top of that, people are also using this lowering of interest rates to buy houses and cars and go on vacation. So it really increases the economic activity when they lower the interest rates. But when you get to a point where you lower the interest rates and you hit the lower bound of zero, it doesn't stimulate the economy anymore. It's just like you didn't drop them enough to get people out there to borrow that money to invest into the business, or even enough to go out there and buy houses and cars and go on vacation. So now what we're thinking about, like, how is it that these rest of these interest rates are coming down when the Federal Reserve was lowering the Fed funds rate? Well, you have to think like the banking system itself, right? Where is it that they're going to put their money? So they can either lend it to you and me and take on risk, or they can find less risk out there by buying into government bonds, or even less risk than that by depositing it with the Federal Reserve itself. So every time they lend this money out there to one of these different entities, like us being risky, government bonds being less risky, and the Federal Reserve essentially no risk, each one of these has a lesser interest rate attached to it, right? So you go all the way to the Federal Reserve and lending money to the Federal Reserve on the overnight lending rate, or I'm sorry, on the excess reserves that the banks have, they're going to find a very small interest rate attached to that. However, if you start going into a position in which you're going to take on a little risk, you can lend it to the government, which is almost no risk, or then you can lend it to you and me. And so now this is where like the banking system starts to find these interest rate adjustments within the markets for things like credit cards and cars and mortgages or whatever, is whether or not these banks or these investors or anybody else out there wants to take on the risk beyond that of what it is that they can get from the government itself. So say, for example, if the U.S. 10-year Treasury is trading at a particular level, then you're going to start finding that most interest rates will follow whatever direction the U.S. 10-year Treasury is moving. Because the banks could, again, they could loan it to them, or they can loan it to you and me. And they're not going to lend it to you and me for a lesser interest rate and take on the risk of us defaulting on our loan, when they can loan it to the government for a higher interest rate and not worry about defaulting on the loan. So anyway, moving on. So anyway, well, we think about it in this fashion. Now, when the Federal Reserve goes to try and adjust rates when they're at the lower bound of zero, it becomes a very difficult tool for them to operate in, because lowering rates hits the lower bound of zero. They can't stimulate the economy with that lowering of interest rates. So what they did is they move into quantitative easing instead. And so this is where the asset purchases come in. And again, they can't buy directly from the Treasury itself. This is talking the Federal Reserve. But they can put out the announcement, hey, we're going to buy $50 billion worth of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities every single month for the foreseeable future, right? And not really tell, or maybe they even have a plan. We're going to do it for the next 18 months, or we'll do it for a certain dollar amount. Like, we're going to do it for, $8 trillion or something. I'm just making up numbers, but this is what like quantitative easing is this projection out there of them buying into the U.S. government debt in a very like, I don't know how to, it's like not just a credible threat, right? Because they're actually doing it. It's more like a guaranteed promise. There we go. Right? It's not, because the credible threat is like, hey, we may or may not do this, but this is a guaranteed promise that they are definitely going to be buying into these treasuries going into the future. So now, when we think about this, it's just like, okay, so the Federal Reserve is now moving into a position in which that the Fed funds rate is hitting zero. Like, right, they can't drop it any further than that, but they're putting out this announcement that they're going to be loading up their balance sheet with a bunch of treasuries, mortgage-backed securities. So now, when you have a guaranteed buyer of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries, like the Federal Reserve is stating, something very interesting happens with these bonds. Now, again, like if you're not familiar with bonds, this is going to get, kind of confusing in it. But to understand that when the yields go down, the prices are moving up. And again, like understanding a bond within itself is not that difficult once you understand it, but to understand that the bond itself has a price tag attached to it that can change on a daily basis. And so when interest rates or yields are coming down, or people are willing to accept a lesser yield, what they are really doing is paying a higher price for that bond. And so as the bond prices start to move up, speculation begins to take place as people are looking not for the return on the investment from the yield itself, but what they're looking for is a return on the speculation, believing that the bond price is going to continue to rise. So as the Federal Reserve saying, hey, for the next, however many months, we're going to buy this many trillions of dollars worth of these bonds, the market out there sees that and they say, okay, well, we're going to front run the Federal Reserve. If there is a definite guaranteed buyer of these bonds and they're going to be lowering the interest rates with this idea of buying up these bonds, I can buy a bond today, sit on it for just a few months, and then sell it to the Federal Reserve or essentially back to the market when the prices move up and the yields come down. So as they're adjusting yields down, the market itself begins to participate inside of the idea of buying up these bonds, which then lowers the yield, not only in mortgage-backed securities, but treasuries, and this happens in all kinds of things. It ends up actually forcing, when these yields come down in such dramatic fashion, it ends up forcing a lot of these investors, these fixed income investors, into taking on risk, and it starts moving a lot of money into corporate debt, even junk bonds. So like this is where a lot of corporations end up finding funding, right? So as the central bank is say, hey man, we're buying up these treasuries, everybody's getting really excited about it. They're moving in, trying to front run the Federal Reserve. The fixed income investors who are normally buying into these safer assets at a particular yield are watching the yield fall and the prices rise, then have to move into ever riskier assets in order to try and acquire that fixed income that they were looking for. And so the safe and liquid asset, the safe treasury debt, no longer is the yield that they are looking for. They start taking on risk, moving into corporate debt. Now these corporations are finding funding that they'll go out there and use to buy equipment, hire people, do whatever it is that the businesses are going to do with that extra funding that they're finding. Now that the investors are like basically moving out of that treasury debt and moving into the higher risk corporate junk bond debt. See how this is confusing? Like there's a lot of people who I get are probably watching this going, oh my God, man, you lost me a long time ago. I get it, man, right? Because this stuff is really difficult to understand. It's not something that is going to be explained inside of just a couple of minutes. Like here we are 20 minutes into it and we're barely even getting started, really. All right, so when we look at the Federal Reserve and how it is that quantitative easing begins to stimulate the economy in the fashion that they were looking for, right? Because it isn't necessarily from the interest rates coming down, but it comes more from the idea that the market is looking for that safe and liquid asset and starts driving the prices up and the yields down. And then the investors are now having to move into the other markets, other riskier markets out there, which then puts that funding out there for them. And this is important to know, because it's essentially the Federal Reserve no longer using the adjusting of the Fed funds rate to stimulate the economy. Right? Because this is essentially coming to an end. They hit zero, so it's just like, okay, we're going to have to set that tool aside right now and not use it anymore, and we're going to have to go into quantitative easing and then use this to try and stimulate the economy with. Not only do you stimulate the economy with the idea that the government is now access all this debt and start spending like fiscal stimulus, that's the government spending money into the economy, whether it's stimulus checks or government programs or whatever, but this is essentially the government going out there and spending the money because we're not borrowing it to spend into the economy, so the government will do it for us. Essentially, that's what's taken place. But then the interest rates themselves are coming down due to the market looking to front run the Federal Reserve and then moving into that higher risk asset like corporate debt, junk bonds, and then essentially funding these corporations, which and then in turn gets the hiring moving. Okay, so when we think about like quantitative easing and what it does for the economy, that's different from what a lowering of the Fed funds rate did prior to the great financial crisis. So you can see the difference that has now taken place. And the Federal Reserve started adopting what they would refer to as forward guidance, because now it's more about your activity within the economy than it is the activity that you do from the Federal Reserve's adjustment. See, this is important to know. Prior to the great financial crisis, the Federal Reserve was very, very quiet with their communication. Like, they did not communicate what it was that they were planning on doing, and then when they did do something, it was a surprise to the markets. And this is how they conducted themselves for a very long time. In fact, most people, when they would listen to the Federal Reserve, would have no idea what it was that was being said by these central bankers. And most of the time, people just didn't care, right? I mean, they just waited for the next Federal Reserve statement to come out and say, hey, this is where the interest rates are. And then they would start conducting themselves in accordance to that interest rate adjustment whenever it had taken place. Well, as the Federal Reserve was moving towards a position in which that they were going to hit the lower bound of zero, and this overnight lending rate was no longer going to be an effective tool for stimulating the economy, they had to change the way that they were going to do things. And this is where the quantitative easing really stepped in. And the use of that forward guidance, which is them basically talking about what it is that they plan on doing going into the future, because this communication about what it is that they plan on doing, like if nobody understood what quantitative easing was, and they were like, man, quantitative easing, and it was just like, it was never reported on the news, nobody ever talked about it, it was this very esoteric thing that is very very far off in the distance that nobody could understand, then it wouldn't have worked. Everybody had to know that it was the money printer going off, and they did massive communication about that in every single direction, right? Money printer, bah, go burr, right? And everybody knew for sure that it was going to create inflationary scenarios. I mean, I know, I was back in the great financial crisis. I was watching my job disappear and thought for sure that silver was going to go to, $500, $1,000 an ounce because of all the hyperinflation that was going to come from all the quantitative easing. You have to think it was far more money printing taking place back in the great financial crisis than took place during COVID. I mean, it was more money in a dollar, like in a number basis, but it was far more on a percentage basis back in the great financial crisis. It took the Fed's balance sheet from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion. I mean, it was better than a quadrupling of the balance sheet. I mean, we all lost our minds, right? I mean, everybody who was, paid attention to what was going on at the time, we were like, everybody was losing it. Like, they just thought for sure that there was no recovery from any of this. But to understand that most of that money did not enter the market. like it did enter into the banking system, but it essentially just sat as reserves on the big banks' balance sheets and never really did get into the economy because it essentially has to get lent into the economy. And so if it's just sitting there, not really chasing goods and services, then it's not going to create any kind of inflationary scenario. And this is essentially what ended up happening to the Federal Reserve since they couldn't find their 2% target. Like, not after all that money printing and from 2008 all the way up into 2018, there was like very little inflation. And when they did find inflation above 2%, it was very short lived. They can't land at 2%. They never have, ever. Ever has the Federal Reserve ever been able to consistently be at 2% for any length of time. So that's why I find it funny that a lot of people are thinking that's what they're trying to do today. It's just like they've never been able to do it before. I don't know why they would think they could do it today. But anyway, moving back to these Fed funds rates and what that really means. All right. Are you guys confused yet? Are you guys having fun? We got 167 people watching with 44 likes. If you guys are really liking this video and liking the information, go hit that like button. Get more people to join in on this YouTube video where we're discussing what Fed cuts mean, right? What does it mean when they cut interest rates? All right. So something interesting took place with the Federal Reserve when it came to September of 2019. Because even though they had this quantitative easing and all this other, changes to the way that they were conducting the monetary policy, they were actually trying to conduct themselves back in that traditional sense, where they were going to raise the Fed funds rate and then try and be restrictive on the economy and then use it for their ammunition to try and stimulate the economy again during the next downturn. This was like very much their idea, right? So if they could raise the Fed funds rate, if the economy was operating at its potential and they were able to like incrementally raise the Fed funds rate and get it up to a particular level that felt appropriate for stimulating the economy during a downturn, meaning that you would have to be able to drop it in order to stimulate again. This is what the Federal Reserve was really hoping that they were going to be able to do, right? And so what they said is like, hey, this is going to be a really boring tightening cycle. We're going to be on what we refer to as autopilot, where we're going to raise a quarter point every quarter for the foreseeable future until we get the Fed funds rate up to a restrictive level that we find appropriate, right? And so they kind of just basically left it at that, saying, hey, we're on autopilot and we're not going to do or say anything different. Then this thing is just going to continue to operate in that fashion. Well, it was tapering is what they were referring this as. And then they had taper tantrum where the markets were very disgusted with this idea. So they were like, okay, so this isn't really going to end up working out very well for us. Talking about the Federal Reserve, they had the Fed funds rate up at 2.5%. And this is going back towards 2018, going into 2019. Right. This is when this is starting to take place. And so something very interesting started to take place in the idea that the Federal Reserve had a lot of government spending taken place, which then had the primary dealers loaded up with Treasury debt. Now, this is something interesting to think about within the banking system, is that Treasury debt, short-term Treasury debt, is looked at almost as good as cash, right? And now it's not cash, but it's like really close to cash. And so a lot of times these big banks will be sitting on a lot of excess or a lot of these reserves that are Treasury debt, right? And because the government was doing all this government spending, they had a lot of this Treasury debt sitting on their balance sheet. Now, in September of 2019, something very interesting took place because, again, the Federal Reserve would try to use that overnight lending rate amongst these big banks in order to adjust the Fed funds rate, which they had, somewhere up around there in that 2%. So what they would try to do is try to, I'm sorry, guys, let me see where I was at on this. So what they had, this again, September of 2019, they were still operating in this overnight lending rate, right, amongst the big banks. But something interesting had taken place in that there was a huge corporate tax payment that was made. And it took a lot of the cash away from the big banks and it moved it over to the Treasury General Account, which is an account over at the Federal Reserve. But the point is that it took it away from the big banks and their ability to use that cash, right? Because it was this tax payment that had taken place. So now they're sitting on all these like government debt from all this government spending that was taking place at the time, and they don't have enough cash to operate the next day, and that overnight lending rate shoots up to like 10% on amongst these big banks. And the Federal Reserve was like, oh no, this is not going to take place. Now, what they did is they fired up something called the Repo facility. Now, the Repo facility has already been used. It's part of the Federal Reserve system, but it was like a pressure relief. It wasn't meant to be used in a consistent, like, standing facility. It was just there in case of emergency purposes. So here you had this huge September tax payment that took a lot of the cash away from the big banks. This is September of 2019. Takes it out of the banking system, leaving the banks short of cash. Overnight lending rate shoots up to like 10%. Fed fires up the repo and says, hey, you give us treasuries, we give you cash. We'll do this flip every single day. And this essentially became what they referred to as the, not the Fed, but everybody in the market referred to as the non-QE QE, because the Fed was injecting cash into the system. But really what they were doing was these overnight swaps, these overnight repos. And so this is how they were able to get cash back into the system, get the liquidity back in there after this huge tax payment had taken place and all this government spending had loaded the banks up with all this government debt. This is how they were able to keep cash in the system, and they just kept rolling like this for a very long time. So now what ended up happening at this point is that that overnight lending rate was no longer an overnight lending rate in the fact that they had a market that was finding it. The repo facility was now injecting liquidity into the system, and it was finding an interest rate there. So what ended up taking place as time moved on, and we eventually fell into COVID, and then the Federal Reserve fired up the real quantitative easing, is that the repo facility ended up becoming the place in which that a lot of people were parking excess cash, right, and getting a smaller return on their interest of an interest rate on it. The overnight lending rate was essentially ineffective because the Federal Reserve had lower requirements, reserve requirements to zero, and moved into what they refer to as an abundant reserve system. So all these big banks were sitting on abundant reserves. They didn't have a place to go as far as lending to those who were in need of reserves. So the overnight lending rate was essentially non-existent in that fashion. So the overnight lending within the repo facility became the place where the Fed funds rate was finding the effective funds, right? Or where the Federal Reserve was finding the effective funds rate. And this is, again, I understand this is difficult, but if you can hold on to this, this is really where it's better to understand how it is that they are conducting themselves today, right? So all of a sudden here we have the repo facility that is acting as a floor as a floor for interest rates. And then they also have a place that they could put money called the account on excess reserves. And so between these two accounts, the repo facility and the account on excess reserves, they were able to channel where it is that they wanted the Fed funds rates to be. So the effective fund rate had moved from the overnight lending rate over to the repo facility in this overnight interest rates, or the interest rate on excess reserves. So this is where they found the place to adjust interest rates from, is with these two different accounts that the big banks were finding a place to park their excess liquidity to. Okay, so now when it comes to the idea of them being in quantitative tightening, right? Because now the excess reserves are going to start drying up, and there's already talk about that. It's just like, hey, the repo facility getting less use, sometimes it gets more use or whatever. This is the liquidity finding its way out of the market, and it's due to the fact that the Federal Reserve is in quantitative tightening. Like, as much as people don't really want to believe it and they think that the money printer is just constantly going off and never stopping, that's not necessarily true. Like, if the Federal Reserve chose to do nothing at all, then quantitative tightening would just automatically take place, as the maturity on the balance sheet of their assets would then start bringing cash back to the Federal Reserve, and unless they rolled that back into new debt, then that cash would essentially be pulled out of the system altogether. So when the Federal Reserve chooses to do nothing at all, that is essentially a form of quantitative tightening, but then they can push that by actually selling treasury debt off or mortgage-backed securities or whatever asset they have on their balance sheet, as opposed to just allowing stuff to roll off at a particular pace. And that's essentially what is happening right now, is the Federal Reserve is allowing a certain amount to come off the balance sheet every single month, which is bringing in the cash, which is a form of quantitative tightening, and it will eventually dry the system up of cash, of liquidity, right? And so here, like, a lot of people are getting very excited about this. They're like, okay, so they're going to lose control. Oh, cool. I just saw an eagle fly by. Anyway, they're going to lose control over interest rates, or they're going to lose control over the market, because you can see it, this whole repo facility is getting questionable. And I'm thinking, well, not really, because the repo facility was like, supposed to be a short-term temporary tool for dealing with the issues that they were having at the time, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be a standing facility for the Federal Reserve. That has only recently taken place, that it is a standing facility, and as people are looking at it saying, oh man, this is a questionable thing, I'm thinking, well, that's a fairly new facility that they are using, and if you really pull the cash back out, you wouldn't need that repo facility. What you would need is a place that you can actually go to get liquidity from the Federal Reserve in a fashion that is more traditional to the Federal Reserve, which is something that they refer to as the discount window, right? So now here's another component to the whole thing, is that when these big banks start looking for liquidity out there and they are finding it difficult to find, to get from these other banks, as things are starting to dry up and the Federal Reserve is pulling in more and more of this liquidity, trying to tighten up the monetary policy to slow the economy down, and get the inflation down. As they're in this quantitative tightening position, some of these banks are eventually going to find a time in which that they're going to need liquidity, right? They're going to need some sort of overnight lending to have taken place. And if the other banks out there are stressed and not able to lend them the money, then they go to the discount window. Now, this discount window for the longest time has been considered a very bad place to go to. If you're one of these big banks who is going to the discount window in order to get credit, to find liquidity so that you can operate, everybody points at you and says, oh, bro, you're in bad shape. Like, you can't get liquidity from anywhere else. You can't borrow from anybody. You have to go to the discount window. That's a bad sign. It shows like you're in, like, it's like kind of like going to the food bank or something. I don't know. It's like, it has this stigma attached to it that says, man, you're not doing well if you're going to the discount window. But yet this is the traditional place that the Federal Reserve would typically offer up cash to these banks. But since it had gotten abused, and all this cash was coming out of the discount window and moving into like speculative assets and stuff like that, it became something of a discouragement to use the discount window from these big banks, and then eventually caught on as a bad deal for these big banks to use it. But really, the Federal Reserve has talked about trying to get this discount window up and running again in a fashion that was more traditional to the way that they had originally used it. And so what they are doing right now, as the repo facility is becoming like, the tool in question, they are actually establishing the discount window as a new effective tool for bringing liquidity to the banking system in a way that doesn't hold that stigma anymore. And what they are doing is they're essentially forcing all the banks to have an account and then use that account at least like once or twice a year. I can't remember what the idea behind it is, but it's something like in that nature. Like, you have to step up to the discount window at some point throughout the year and borrow money. Like, I mean, I guess that's the easiest way to kind of explain it. And by doing this, nobody knows exactly who it is that's in trouble when they go to the discount window, because they can essentially just say, hey man, we're forced to kind of do it at least once a year, so we're taking our moment now. Right. And now, whether or not they're in bad shape or, need to do it, they can always have that kind of excuse behind it that says, we're not in bad shape, we're just being forced to do this instead. And now we have this availability of using the discount window, and nobody is really going to point the finger at us and say, hey man, you're in bad shape or whatever. All right. Where was I going with that? I don't know. What are you guys talking about? We're 40 minutes into this. I think we've gotten quite a bit going on here. Trash Can says, suit yourself. I just call in the next step after Nihilism. Cash purchase of house. The repo man is always bad. If you can't afford it, don't buy it. Again, note the difference between buying and owning. Possessions is 9/10 of the law. All right. Anyone can buy anything with debt, but you don't own it. You're just a glorified renter. All right. What if you borrowed money to buy a tattoo? Are you a glorified renter at that point? I mean, it's like good luck repossessing it, you know. All right, because it's fractional. Trucker Bud, hello UE. Just because you were born, you have to work your A off all your life. Yeah, essentially. Yeah, that's what you get for being born, you know. And this is where the struggle really begins, because I think a lot of times people think, man, this sucks. Why is it that we're put on this earth just to have to work as hard as we do? But then, you know, really, I don't know if people realize it as much as they do, but working as hard as they do is like, I mean, I don't know quite how to explain this, but it was the reasonings why you're here, right? Like, I think about it myself, the times that I have worked really hard and, you know, kind of screwed my shoulders up and stuff like that. I think, like, man, why was I gone through all that punishment? Why did I have to do all this? Why was you know, essentially the suffering was there? But now I look back on those times, and if I didn't go through all that stuff, I never would have learned how to be in the position that I am today. Like, I never would have learned lessons or skills or abilities or knowledge or all that other stuff. Every single bit of it. And at the time, it seems ridiculous. And I know it sounds really cliche when, you know, it's just like, man, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger or something like that. But that's really the truth behind it all. It's like every single person in your life was a teacher, no matter who it was. Whether you liked them or hated them, it didn't matter. They taught you something. And if you took the lesson from it, then you learned and you moved on. But if you didn't take the lesson from it, you're probably going to engage somebody who's very much similar like that person, right? And so every time that we have a struggle or a challenge or a reward or an accomplishment or all this other stuff, it's just another step in the progress of what it is that we are doing to try and figure out why it is that we were on this planet to begin with, which is generally to figure out our passion, right? Like for me, it's talking economics, and I just love this topic. I can sit here and just talk it all day long, every day from now on, no doubt about it. But for other people, it might be playing music, or it might be doing some other form of art. It might be, you know, cooking, you know, which is, in my opinion, another form of art. Yeah. So anyway, moving on. Tattoos were the only thing the ancient Celts could keep when they fell in battle. Buying versus owning. Yeah. Force, what is that? Incarceration is the real reason we are here. Incarnation, is that what that says? Oh man, I don't know. Incarnation, forced incarnation. Maybe. It's seriously screwed up when they have to devise a whole division of study to make up things why they should have the right to steal our money. Got to love modern monetary theory. While they steal our money, this is something that's interesting to think about. They don't steal our money. What we are doing is we are using their Federal Reserve notes, which we really shouldn't be doing. Like, that's our choice to do that. We shouldn't be doing it, but because we do it, now we have to suffer the consequences of that established rules that they put within the use of their Federal Reserve notes. We should be using gold and silver, and then they wouldn't be able to inflict a lot of the pain that they do upon the people. However, there would be a whole different set of pain that would be different from, you know, from the economic forces that take place by having a limited currency out there. But if you really don't want to use the Federal Reserve notes, then don't. I think everybody should abandon the idea of using the Federal Reserve notes. Nobody's going to do that. Every single person's retirement, every single person's business, every single person's job, every single bill, everything that they have is all tied to the Federal Reserve note and whether or not they can cash out for it. Like, everybody is in that same boat. Like, nobody's thinking, oh man, I hope I can cash out for Bitcoin. I hope I can cash out for silver. Like, I'm going to, you know, sell this computer off here for anything other than $1 is going to be a very unlikely chance. Like I might find somebody who can trade me Bitcoin or silver for it, but everybody, like if I was to sell it or somebody wanted to buy it, everybody's going to have dollars to do it. And so therefore you are forced into that system, but it's a complete voluntary system. You do not have to use it. We choose to. We choose to use it out of convenience too, you know. Lumber video. You guys want lumber videos? Yeah, lumber is down right now. I was thinking about doing just a regular, like a short video, like an 8-minute video talking about lumber. But lumber is down right now. We're at like 550 per thousand, 560 per thousand. I didn't check it before I started this, which is a position in which that I know that these mills do not want to operate in. And anytime you get below that 600, you start getting into 550 per thousand, you're going to find that the mills are going to continue to pull back on their production. We had a bit of production increase when it ran up to 600 per thousand, but it wasn't significant. It was like up at 600. We had depleted inventory at the time. You know, the idea that the Federal Reserve was lowering interest rates, I think, kind of got excited into the market, and you saw a lot of people buying into the futures, but it didn't like raise the futures significantly. It went from like, I don't know, it was like at 610, I think, just slightly over 600 per thousand. And now we're at 550 per thousand. So it is a pretty dramatic drop, but this is right where we have been for months now. And the mills, again, I know are not going to be excited about producing at 550 per thousand. They are going to tighten up production, and we are going to find the inventory levels dropping. They are producing right now 2x4, 2x6 plate stock and studs. Now, this is the most common length and the most common size of lumber that is out there right now that is going to be purchased. This is what the mills want to produce. That is the things that are going to sell. 2x8, 2x10, 2x12, those longer lengths, those not so much demand for them. So why would they produce them if they're not going to sell? The problem with this is that now those products are coming in such short supply that we're finding that the price of them is starting to really dramatically rise. Like a complete disconnect from the rest of the items that are out there. To give you an example, like I was looking at some price sheets the other day, and 2x12, 8-foot and 10-foot boards, right? Just the 8-footers, the 10-footers on a 2x12, standing and better, KD. I think they were selling somewhere around, I want to say like, I think they had them listed at like 585 per thousand, right? It was pretty low. And then you go up to the 16s, the 18s, and the 20s, and they're up at like 11 or 1200 per thousand. So like almost double the price. Like you take two units, you put them side by side, you put them end to end, and it's the same length as buying one that isn't cut down the middle, and it's twice the price going to the longer lengths. It's simply because the amount of inventory that is out there is very depleted, where the amount of 2x12 eights is probably quite large, right? Because like 2x12 8-footers and 10-footers are not a very popular size. I mean, most of the time when you're buying a 2x12, you're using it for like a joist or a rafter or something of that nature, and they're usually kind of a longer length, not necessarily an 8 or a 10-footer. So, you know, here you have plenty of inventory on the 8s and 10s, and it's reflective in the price being down around 500 or 600, 550 to 600 per thousand. But then you get into the diminished inventory of the longer lengths, and it's like twice the price. And it's obvious to me that there is huge gaps in inventory. And so if we have this situation continuing where we have a low futures price, which is not going to encourage the mills to go out there and produce a lot other than what it is that is selling, you're going to find that there's going to be ever more depletion of those other items. Beams is another big one. There was a recent mill shutdown up in Washington, permanent shutdown, and all of a sudden it became very difficult to source out a lot of the beam stock that was available out there. I mean, now it is available because you start finding it, you know, it starts flowing in from other places. But when that mill shut down, it had a definite impact in our area for a few weeks, as it became very difficult to source out a lot of the beams, you know, 6x material especially. So anyway, we're going to do a better lumber video going into the, you know, here in the future. All right, a long story short, $2. Thank you so much. What's the worst lumber mill injury you saw? I've never worked in a lumber mill itself, right? I do lumber retail sales for a living. Now, I do live in the Pacific Northwest, so there is a lot of mills around here and a lot of logging operations and sorting yards and stuff like that. When I was a kid, you would hear about logging injuries more than necessarily mill injuries, right? Now, the mill injuries you would find, like, especially like the old timers, you would find like around town, they'd be missing fingers and stuff like that, because the way that they operated back in the day was a hell of a lot more dangerous than a lot of the automated ways that they do things today. Now, logging, on the other hand, that is an incredibly dangerous job. Like, I mean, it's pretty much done the same way that they've always done it, where you go and you fall these trees down a hill, right? It's not easy to get equipment down there. So what they do is they run cables down, hook up all these logs, and then yard them up the hill, running off of these cables. And logs can go swinging and flying all over the place. And it's like, it's hard work. It's dangerous. It's hard to move around. And, everything about it is like, is difficult. So I think, like, when it comes to injuries, you would probably find that there would be more injuries within the logging industry itself than there would be within the mill industry. So, and as for me, like, I do like lumberyard stuff, right? So we're not like sorting out logs and running saws or anything like that. We're taking units of lumber off of trucks, breaking it down into smaller units, and then sending those units out to people who are building houses or building their deck, or remodeling, or window packages, or door trim, or whatever it is that they got going on. Market crash coming in January or February? Question. Will it pop the personal and federal debt bubble? I don't know. Do you really want to end the Federal Reserve? Actually, ending the Federal Reserve is that something that I really want to do? It's not something that I don't want to do. It's not something that I would go against. But honestly, to end the Federal Reserve, I think it would probably be best done by having people understanding what the Federal Reserve really means to them, and then simply making them insignificant. That's how I think we should end the Federal Reserve. I don't think we should take like control through congressional means, or legislation or administration or whatever should step in. I think really we as the people, if we were to truly understand what it meant to end the Federal Reserve, it would mean that we'd just make them insignificant in our life. And if we could learn how to do that on an individual basis, to say, okay, here's the things that I need in my life, and here's the way that I can go about it in order to exclude them out of it. I can save in silver and cryptocurrencies, for one, so that I am not part of inside of the banking system. And then if I am part of the banking system, to only use it in the absolute most limited fashion that can absolutely find. And if you can start conditioning yourself in this way, and then again, you also have to be in like the mindset that says, I don't want to enjoy any of this for pleasure, but then take out debts to buy cash flowing assets, so that it is nothing but 100% of benefit to the people themselves, as opposed to people slave wages trying to pay for a luxurious debt. Right? You see where I'm kind of getting at? Like, this is literally taking the mindset of the people themselves in order to do it. Like, I don't think there's any organization, any group of lawyers, any whatever, who can come together and say, hey, we're going to end the Federal Reserve and make a better way. I think us as individual people can think, man, I want to end the Federal Reserve on my own. And how do I do that? How do I make them insignificant in my life? And all of us do that together, and it would work. It would totally work. Because the use of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve notes is voluntary. We are choosing to do it every single day. Right? And as much as we want to bitch and complain about it, that it isn't a right system or whatever, every day you're pulling cash out of your pocket, or you're swiping a debit card, or you're, saving inside of a cash denominated asset, or wanting to be paid in cash at the end of the day. So again, you are voluntarily doing this. No such thing could exist. Inflation of the money supply would dictate it. I suppose there wouldn't be quantitative easing. They would have to find buyers for the debt at free market rates. Well, first of all, they wouldn't be able to find anybody to buy the debt because there wouldn't be any debt to issue, because we would not be a manufacturing state that would then give us the ability to pay back that debt, because we could get new money in from being a production saving nation. So we wouldn't be able to find people to buy our debt. Right? It wouldn't work that way. And then we wouldn't be able to pay it back anyway, because we would default on it, considering that it would most likely be gold or silver or something of that nature. And then we wouldn't have enough of it because we're not a productive nation. In order for a thing to qualify as money, it needs to increase in supply. Well, I think that would be, I don't know, is that in order? All right. Wait, there is no debt. Laugh out loud. Never mind. My brain is stuck in the debt-based currency thinking. Magical thinking, Simon. I'm not sure. No Fed means no lumber. Well, there was lumber before the Fed, so I don't know if that's true. All right. And again, I don't necessarily think that we even need to end the Federal Reserve. Understanding why it is or how it is that you could do that, and then be in a position in which that you could essentially conduct yourself in a way that says, hey, if the Fed was here or not, it would make no difference to me. Right? That's what I think is really where the mindset of the people should go to. Right? The Federal Reserve is going to continue to create a situation in which that the inequality is going to grow. I don't want that. I don't like that idea. And I mean, it's not whether I want it or don't, doesn't really make any difference on the grand scheme of things, because what I want is different from what everybody else wants. But the Federal Reserve, and being in existence, is going to create a situation in which that the inequality will continue to grow. And so knowing that there's going to be issues not only for my kids, but for the grandkids, if that happens to ever come into existence, and going into the future, so long as the Federal Reserve is entering new money into the system, we're going to find that it's going to be ever increasingly more difficult to find your way onto the other side of the wedge. I don't like that idea. Right? Now, understanding how that happens now gives me an ability to say whether or not I like it or dislike it, or doesn't matter, right? That part is neither here nor there. The fact that it is taking place now requires me to do something about it for myself. Like, I can't change other people's minds. I can't tell other people what to do with their lives. I can't tell them how to think. But what I can do is see that other people think and believe and act in certain ways. And now I can conduct myself in a way that says this is the most appropriate position that I need to take. Part of that is working a lot, right? I work a 9 to 5 job. I come out and do YouTube. I got a side hustle that I do. I put a lot of effort out there in order to have some of the things in my life that I do, which isn't material possessions, but it's living in a house, right? It's being able to save for in stocks or crypto or silver or whatever it is that I'm buying at the time. This is the reason why I do it as much as I do. It's not so I can have fancy things in my life. It's because I see out there that there's a lot of other people out there who are not trying their hardest, and what they are trying for is luxurious. And so I'm thinking, okay, I need to do the opposite of that. I need to try extra hard and not get into luxuries, and try to be as disciplined as I possibly can for it, because this isn't no joke. Right? I mean, I'm not trying to figure out a better system out there. There isn't a better system. There's only this system and what it is that you're doing with it. Central banks were a great solution to a problem that occurred 150 years ago. Local banks issuing their own banknotes and then going under may not so needed in 2024. Yeah, and I kind of agree with that. It was trying to figure out a way that they could have an elastic money supply that would smooth out the business cycles, which would make a lot of sense. Like, at the time, there was people out there who would absolutely lose everything they had overnight in bank runs and just terrible economic times. And we have to think, like, this is humans inventing stuff on the fly. Right? Like, this isn't like, people have figured it out over time that if they have a certain amount of currency that's limited, and then they put people in debt, then they can have slaves in that sort of fashion. Like, I mean, I get that part of it, but ultimately when it comes to the money system that we use today, it was completely invented out of necessity. Essentially, we all want to do transactions. We want to trade carrots for fish, and we couldn't figure out exactly how to do that efficiently. And there was people out there who says, this gold thing seems to work out pretty good for trading around for everybody. And so begins the banking systems, right? It was just a matter of time. And I'm not trying to say that there isn't people out there who have taken advantage of the situation and manipulated the concept to put themselves in the best position. That definitely happens out there. But again, it's all voluntary, All right, we are economic animals. Money isn't funny. No, you're right. We do the best we can with what we have. Human nature isn't easy. You're absolutely right. Human nature is not easy, and because trying to figure out exactly what ended up happening to me when this channel took off, and all of a sudden it was just like my whole world is changing, and I don't even understand why. I got a lot of networking that is all of a sudden just building up like crazy. I have money that's flowing in. I'm getting invites to do things that I have never done before, and I could not figure out what the hell what it was that was going on. And so, trying to go back and kind of reverse engineer what it was that was taking place, studying up on a lot of psychological things that, people end up going through. Like for me, it was like this imposter syndrome. Like, what in the hell am I doing here? Like, I am not somebody who should be talking economics on this level, have this many subscribers, all this other stuff. Like, I felt very out of place by it all because I just simply just didn't understand what it was that was what was happening, right? The more that time went on, the more I realized, man, this is a genuine feeling that a lot of people end up getting when all of a sudden it's just this major change has happened to them, right? And much like I was experiencing with the growth of the YouTube channel. So understanding human nature and learning a lot about economics and what it is that human nature does for economics, and especially when it comes to like a lot of the economic forces that are out there, understanding human nature and the desires and impulsive behaviors and just general like aspects of what it is that's a human, it really has a major impact on how it is that you see the economy. Like, it's no wonder when I see out there people who are making absolute horrible decisions with their finances. Like people who are living paycheck to paycheck and they figure out a way to get a new car. And then now they're living paycheck to paycheck with a new car. And they feel really excited about this at first. Right? And I'm thinking, man, this is all like internal dopamine stuff like happening inside of that, and it's not logical thinking that's taking place for the future, in which that you can position yourself so that you would be the most appropriate. Instead, man, I look cool in this car. What do other people think of me? Man, I'm so happy because I have this thing in my life now, but it's not really even yours. And again, this is like, stuff that I had studied up on quite a bit to try and just, figure out what it is that's taking place within the economy. But man, human nature is strange. Like even some of the things like even some of the things when it comes to this relationship issues, how it is that couples look at money differently, what it is that they use money for. I watch people, and luckily my wife's not this way at all, but I mean, I can see how other people are, and they get like this retail therapy, shopping therapy, like they get a charge off of making a purchase. And now to me, like, I don't get a charge off of making a purchase. Like, I really don't. Like, I don't buy things just to buy it for a feeling of getting like excited about buying something. To me, that's a very like I have a hard time fathoming this. It's like, what? This is a real thing. But I understand that other people feel this, right? And it's not necessarily like the item itself that they want. It's this act of the purchase itself that gives them this feeling. And again, like, I don't get it. So it's just like, but other people do. And then when you have this like supercharged ability amongst people out there with the access to credit cards, or even more than that, all kinds of things out there to make purchases, pay now, buy now, pay later ideas. It's no wonder why we have such a messed up society of people who believe that the system is against them, because every time they turn around, there's somebody else saying, hey, remember that thing that you did all those months back? Yeah, you need to, take some time, not enjoy your pleasurable experiences and pay back for that, right? And then they're all pissed off, right? All right, moving on. Best to figure out the system we're in and move and go from there. Most people don't even do that. No, I agree. Angry capitalists. Then after 1913, the business cycle became more of a became even more bumpy. Well, I don't think the business cycle necessarily became more bumpy. I mean, it did, because it took a while to smooth out, but I think what really ended up happening is that we switched from business cycles to debt cycles. And then it became very, very difficult, because it never gave a chance for the redistribution of wealth to happen like we did back in the day, right? So like you'd have this accumulation of money into a handful of people, and then it would get distributed on, boom, right? But now we have this concentration of money that goes up to the wealthy. Everybody starts to suffer the consequences. We have a slowdown in the economy, and when it comes time to redistribute the wealth back out there, which basically means a shit pot of defaults and failures and bankruptcies and all this other stuff, and that's the rich losing their ability, they just then pump more money in, and then they just keep going up, right? So, and then eventually the money, filters up to the top, it concentrates, these people start to suffer again. And again, that moment that should take place to, redistribute back out there doesn't take place. The defaults don't happen. Too big to fail. Inflate some more money, right? And it just keeps. And so this is the reason why the inequality just keeps getting worse and worse and worse every year. And then people say, man, why is it so hard out here? Well, it's just like, well, you think about it, man. If you're on the bottom side of the wedge and you're looking to the top side of the wedge and you're thinking, man, look how far away they've gotten, right? No wonder why it's so hard to move over to the other side of the wedge. There was a time they weren't that far away. And being on the other side of the wedge was really just a matter of just having a good paying job. Having a good paying job means access to like a productive job, manufacturing job. When we were a productive, saving nation, it was really easy to be on the other side of the wedge. You just go and you work for a while, you were disciplined for a few years, and you had the ability to then start buying houses and cars and getting the family together and all the other stuff that went along with it. Since it doesn't work that way anymore, it makes it very, very hard on the people to have a 9 to 5 job and say, now what do I do? So it's like, now you got to go and get more money, right? Because you see how far inflated away that the people who have moved, right? The people who have moved dramatically away. Like I would never be able to afford any of this stuff that I have going on if I didn't have a day job. My wife has a day job. I have YouTube. I have side hustles. I got all this other stuff going on. And this isn't easy to do, right? And then people will go out there, it was just like, how do we create a society in which that a 9 to 5 job is going to work again for them? We're not. It is not going to happen, all right? More 9 to 5 jobs are going to become less effective inside of this economy. And those people are going to have to find other ways of bringing in extra money, whatever that means, right? There is no such thing as extra money. It's either the money you're making or it's not. So just knowing that it's going to be that way. It's just easier to understand it in that fashion, because that way then you don't have to worry about somebody coming in who can say, hey man, I can make this better. I can fix it. We can have rebuild back better bullshit, whatever that is, all right? And you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, because now you can look at it and say, okay man, I need to make the appropriate decision for myself on what it is that we see going on out here. And knowing exactly how it's happening or why it's happening, you may not have to know the exact details of every single banking ability transaction, the technical aspects of it, but you do have to know that the new money comes in and how that new money comes in, whether it's injected into the hands of the poor people or it's given to the rich. With the idea of a trickle-down economics, it doesn't work that way. Anytime you ever inject new money into the system, I don't care how you do it, you will find a separation between the rich and the poor. You can give it to the poor for a while and they'll be all singing, hey man, this is great, thank you for the money, right? But give it any kind of length of time and you're going to find that money will leave the poor people's hands, it will be funneled up to the rich, and the rich will have separated themselves even further away. Very little doubt in my mind about that. All right, moving on. While poor people use credit cards for food, saving in Bitcoin is the best way. Fixed supply assets they can't mine more of or print more of. Yeah, and see the problem if you do that, if you sitting in, like, let's just say for example we went back to a gold standard. The United States has too high of a standard of living in order to maintain this standard of living from our own production. We do produce stuff here, but we don't produce enough, right? And so we have to import the stuff that we enjoy in our life to maintain this higher standard of living, to enjoy this luxury. If we start moving into a gold standard, what we're going to do is import stuff and export gold, and then we're going to all be broke in poverty and misery because we don't have any money left in this nation because we've exported all the money for our luxurious experience of a higher standard of living. So that's cool. I'm cool with it. Let's go back to a gold standard, but we're going to have to also understand our standard of living is going to fall dramatically because we won't be able to import all this stuff from around the globe, right? Our lives are going to fall dramatically, and those who were sitting in a position of holding on to gold and silver while this is taking place are probably going to do quite well, especially those who understand the idea of lending their asset out there. And if it's a limited one like gold or silver, those who have a little bit of gold and silver are going to be considered filthy rich. So, I mean, like, I'm cool with the whole idea. I really am. Like, I mean, I don't, like, one way or the other, I'm not, like, I'm neither here nor there saying yay or nay or not. I'm down for it. I will do whatever it is that I need to do in order to conduct myself in that particular situation. But to say, hey, we need to do it this way is not exactly accurate, right? I mean, it's probably accurate just fine, but it's not going to be a benefit. It's not going to help. It's not going to do things in which that is going to have everybody going, man, this is the way we really need to do it, right? There's going to be plenty of problems, suffering, pain, and misery that take place during that as well. That's fine. It happens in every situation, no matter what kind of system you have going, right? You can have a perfect system and you will have war because you will have to fight in order to keep the system perfect. So a perfect system is an impossibility. It can't happen, right? Because the moment that you have perfect, you will be fighting, which is imperfect, to maintain perfect. So perfect is an impossibility. You can't get there. There's no way. America is basically a service-based economy. Yeah, that's right. So you have to import stuff and then sell that stuff to each other. All right, that's essentially it. That's how we have an economy, is selling things to each other. Terp, ignore crypto, focus on Bitcoin. Yeah, I'm more of just a Bitcoin enthusiast. Like, I have some other altcoins out there, but really, I don't know of anything else out there that is going to quite match what Bitcoin is doing, can do, or will do into the future, especially if you have a secondary layer system to it. So, like, to me, it's Bitcoin, and everything else is very much like a distant second to it. Yeah. All Nighter says, TGIF, I'm all done with work, but gotta take my son back to his mom, so I'll be piloting my truck for a while. Right on, All Nighter. I'm glad to see you're up in here, bro. All right. Greg, that's my question. What's your question? Bitcoin is the future. Nothing else is decentralized. Bitcoin isn't the future. Does it have a future? Sure. It's going to be in existence. People are using it, but it's not going to be the future of currency. It's not going to be a world reserve currency. I guarantee you it's not. All right. I know it's not because it can't operate as a world reserve currency without constantly being a deflationary aspect, which means that nobody's going to borrow in Bitcoin. Nobody's going to start businesses with borrowed money in Bitcoin because they'll all have to, like, suffer the fact that they are going to have to work incredibly hard to pay back a deflationary currency, which is going to make it ever so more burdensome on them. So a deflationary currency is not a good one. It's not, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, right? I mean, good or bad, it's neither here nor there. A deflationary currency that, such as Bitcoin, would create a situation in which that the most industrious people out there will hoard all the money. If you are exporting stuff and you're importing Bitcoin, you are going to be in a position in which that you will import Bitcoin, denying the rest of the world out there the ability to use Bitcoin because you have it. Right? Now, you could be in a position in which that you can lend it back out there to the rest of the world, but they're going to have to pay you back in Bitcoin, which is limited, and then they're going to start suffering the consequences from that, not being able to pay back their Bitcoin inside of a deflationary currency. So most people are probably not going to be even borrowing it from you because they won't be able to pay it back anyway. So now, if you're exporting stuff and importing Bitcoin and you're hoarding all the Bitcoin because you're most industrious and you're creating world depressions and issues across the globe because they don't have a currency to work with, then you're going to find that Bitcoin is going to end up finding its way away from those most industrious people as they start falling into poverty and misery, as they will no longer be able to sustain their elevated, luxurious way of life because they cannot get no more new money coming in. So it's a business cycle that is just fine. I'm cool with it. I have no problems with it at all. Most people will suffer under the consequences of having a limited currency such as that of Bitcoin, as the Cantillon effect will constantly be ripping through the economies and the nations out there, creating booms and bust cycles and massive depressions and misery and pain for the people out there, starvations and famines and all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm not looking forward to seeing any of that stuff. Now, is it the natural consequence of it? It is. Okay? But we won't have governments running rampant spending either. So, that's cool. I mean, I'm good with it. Either way, I don't care. Yeah. Don't get caught up in hypotheticals today. You can take out loans in fiat and stack Bitcoin. Rinse, repeat until you can't. Buy silver, platinum, and crystallize osmium? Osmium? What the hell's that? All right, baby boomers are saving. I get what you mean, but today they allow us to print fiat to buy BTC. Wouldn't buy platinum at this point. Catalytic converters demand is going to decrease gradually from electronics. Like, share, subscribe. Yes, please do. I mean, we got 147 people watching with 90 likes. Go hit that like button. What time is it? We're at almost 3 o'clock here. I don't know how much longer I'm going to stick it out for. I was just going to be out here for an hour, but we've gone far past that. Inquire about Bitcoin ETF for your retirement 401k. This may be a way to get safe exposure for starters. No. I don't know, maybe. Like, to me, I don't have a whole lot of expectations. I don't have a whole lot of expectations when it comes to cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin or anything else. I buy a little bit of it. I'm trying to build up to one Bitcoin. Like, I would love to have one whole Bitcoin in my possession, or the equivalent of one whole Bitcoin anyway. And that's it. Like, that's my entire thing. Now, I was not expecting it to run up as high as it has, and I was certainly not expecting it to take over, like, as far as the biggest position, as far as everything within my investment portfolio would be. Bitcoin and Coinbase have absolutely dominated it, and I didn't even try to do it that way. Like, I was wanting it to be in other things, like stock market or something of that nature. I didn't want it to be. I was just whatever, right? And so that's where it ended up going. Like, I don't know if there's anything else out there that's going to be moving as dramatically and as obvious as cryptocurrencies and digital currencies are over the next 10 years. Like automation, maybe. That might be a big one, but that kind of goes along lines with the cryptocurrencies and digital tokenizing and stuff like that. So, in my opinion, like, this is what the big change is going to be. People looking at, like, where is it that we need to position our money? Like, how do you know which one of these things is going to end up being like Amazon? Right. Like, back when Amazon was being pushed out of a garage, nobody cared. Nobody like looked at that and said, "Oh man, this is going to be the biggest thing ever." Nobody had any expectations of that, right? But as time went on, it turned out to be an amazing company that really just blew up when it comes to being able to be a distributor around the globe. That was something that really people did not see at the time, right? Now, considering where it is that cryptocurrencies are going today and the tokenizations and stable coins and the speaking of it and talking, again, this is going to be a very odd place to go to try and figure out where it is that you need to be for that, like, Amazon kind of event for you. There's a lot of alternative, like a lot of altcoins out there, a lot of projects, a lot of concepts, and people have like the next greatest idea and invention and thoughts of what it is that's going to be taking place. That's a hard one to pick, right? I've gotten a few, like, yeah, I'll pick up $50 worth of some altcoin if, like, it seems exciting or something like that. But again, I have very little expectations of any of this stuff out there. And really, I don't see anything outside of Bitcoin. Like, when it comes to currencies or when it comes to this digital currency, you're looking for something that is absolutely like distributed security, like as far as not being able to do a 51% hack. Like, I don't see anything else that comes close to what Bitcoin is doing. So, I could be wrong on that in the end, but everybody knows Bitcoin. Hardly anybody knows any of the alternate coins, unless you're really in it, All right, Bitcoin will continue to be the most relevant asset of the rest of our lifetime. The automated robots of the future may be compensated in digital currencies. Stop with the, well, whatever. Okay. Greg, decentralization and anonymity and the government hands off of the only way Bitcoin to live up to the creator's intent on the white paper. Back to the original topic. Yeah, there we go. We should get back to the original topic, which is, what does it really mean to, like, lower rates? Because let's talk about that just a little bit, because there's going to be another rate cut, and people are really excited about this whole idea and what it is that it's going to mean for their future, especially when it comes to their investments or their purchases, something of that, of like a house, the mortgages. And I laugh about it because I think to myself, man, I have talked so many times about how the Federal Reserve and the adjustment of rates is no longer the effective tool, but the actual communication about those rates is the effective tool that is being used within the economy itself. Now, when I think about what happened when the Federal Reserve cut rates and then mortgage rates went up, like, what is it that other people expect coming from the Federal Reserve rate cuts is, in my opinion, somewhat delusional. Like, people think, okay, if they cut rates, then that's going to make mortgage rates cheaper. Okay, you do realize that if the Federal Reserve cut rates, it takes anywhere from 6 months to a year before it really starts to impact the economy. So if you're talking like next year sometime, okay, all right, maybe then we can talk about like where the economy might be. But people are looking for a rate cut now to make decisions on what they are doing next week. And to me, that has more to do with the credible threat, because the credible threat and what that does to the markets out there, I think, are very important, and they are very, very well, how do I say this, like, they're very well understood that like from the Federal Reserve, they understand that their communications has a profound impact on the markets. Now, on the general economy, that is different. Like the markets, the Dow Jones, all those, that is not the economy, right? People look at like the Dow and say this is the economy. It's not, right? The economy is you and me and the decisions that we make every single day with what it is that we're doing with our retirements, our business, those purchases that we make, whether or not we're moving or staying or whatever. That's the economy, the decisions that you and I make every single day with our lives, the jobs that we take. The markets themselves, that is a reflection of business activity that is happening out there, and not always is that going to be like accurate to what it is that's happening with the economy itself. Like you can see things happening within the stock market that then has like people like shoving a bunch of money towards it, and they say, hey, look at this, the economy is doing well. That's not. That is a speculation, that is market, misinterpreting. There's all kinds of stuff that could be happening within that. However, what it is that we are doing for our daily lives for the next few years is not going to be impacted by that, right? Like, I mean, it could if, like, you get laid off or something of that nature. But ultimately, if you still have a job, you're not going to change the way that you conduct yourself because the markets went up and down. Right? You're still going to show up the next day. You're still going to be doing the same thing, still paying the bills, doing the things that you've always done. So the market isn't necessarily a reflection of the economy. It can be over time. Like, this is like the Dow over the last 10 years has done this, right? Okay, so you can look at it like that. But to know that it's like we ourselves are the economy, right? And what we do with the interest rate adjustments usually ends up being time down the road, right? 6 months from now, a year from now, those interest rates will have impacted enough of us out there to actually do something within the economy. Like, just because you lower rates tomorrow doesn't mean that it does anything. All the rest of the people and their interest rates and everything that they've got, that stays the same. Like, some people might have some adjustable rates out there that will work with the lowering of the Fed funds rate, but most of the people are stuck in fixed rates. That doesn't change anything, right? And so when we think about it in that fashion, it was just like, how many people need to go out there and start borrowing money at that lower rate to actually start being an impact on the economy? Like, how many cars have to be purchased? How many homes have to be purchased? And then if the rate is just slightly less than what it was before, how can it have a really profound impact if it's just making things slightly better than they were before? And then how far out does that take? All right, there's a lot of home equity just waiting for the rates to go down. Yeah, I mean, I know I got a lot of home equity, but I ain't really waiting to take it out. I'm actually pretty happy with the fact that I have now moved under, oh, I don't even want to say it. Never mind. Let's move on. All right. Have you read Lynn's book yet? Broken Money? I have not, but I was talking with somebody the other day who had read it, and I was like, as we were sitting there talking, I'm like, yeah, I know that lady. I mean, look, and I showed a picture of me standing next to her at the Rebel Capitalist, and they were absolutely amazed. They were like, holy crap, you really do know her. And I'm like, yeah, I know her. I know who she is. Like, I mean, not that I would, but I could, like, hey, call her up, hey, Lynn, what's happening, But that would be a kind of a weird conversation to have, so. Proof of stake and other systems that use less electricity than proof of work. Yeah. All right, keep it professional, folks. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. All right. Bitcoin code was outdated years ago, but has a name recognition and investor backing. There are other cryptos that can do far more transactions per second, as an example. Yeah, I agree with that, but I think the difference inside of it is like the security level of Bitcoin is far more than anything else is out there. And then with secondary layer systems like the Lightning Network or something of that nature, I think that they can solve all the problems of transactions not being fast enough for the actual Bitcoin protocol to use. Bro, you absolutely do not watch any of her content. I wish you would. You're right. I don't watch any of her content, but I don't watch anybody else's content. I make up my own content from what it is that I am finding and discovering and presenting out there. Like I said, I was doing this a long time ago. I did it, I don't know, probably like 4 years ago. I said, I'm going to turn everybody else off, all the rest of the YouTubers, all the people that I followed on a regular basis. I turned them all off because I was parroting them. I would sound just like Peter Schiff. After listening to Peter Schiff for a week, I would start putting information out there that sounded exactly like his. And I thought to myself, am I really coming up with my own stuff? Am I really doing my own research? Am I really understanding this on my own way? And when I started moving into that direction, saying, okay, as much as I love these people, as much as I respect them, and as much as I appreciate their information and hard work and everything that they're putting out there, I'm going to try and do this for myself and try and figure this thing out for myself. And so I'm not going to listen to him anymore, and I'm going to start coming up with my own content from my own research that I am doing. And when I started doing that, I realized, dang, I am not sounding anything like any of these other people out here, and these other people are not cluing in on the things that I am doing the research into. Very interesting. Now, I've listened to Lynn plenty of times out there, and I've listened, I mean, I haven't listened to her lately, but I have listened to her many times, and not everything that she was talking about I agreed with because of some of the things that I was finding. Right? I'm like, okay, so like I get that part. Like I get a lot of these things that these people are saying, but because they haven't incorporated this particular aspect into it from the things that the Federal Reserve has blatantly said that they are doing, like moderately above 2% for some time, average inflation rate, right? And since nobody really seems to take this thing into consideration, most of the arguments that they use incorporate ideas of a 2% target, or that they lost control of inflation, or that they didn't even want inflation, right? So many different people have this strategy towards it because this is what the Federal Reserve has communicated out there in the mainstream media, and everybody starts regurgitating the same information. And I'm thinking to myself, this is all wrong. Every single bit of it. All these people out there are completely gaslit. Right? And here I am trying to explain it. I get a handful of people who understand what it is that I'm trying to communicate. I'm doing this through their own words and documents. Like I'm not making anything up, like nothing. I don't make anything up. Even the idea of dollar funding stresses in China is a Federal Reserve document that we went and did a members only live stream over, talking about how China is absolute in desperate need of dollars in order to facilitate the bond issuance that they had done in their own nation to other foreign people out there. Like they wrote bonds due in dollars. They didn't have anything to do with the United States. Doesn't have anything to do with our government, our corporations, our banking system, our people, nothing. Right? But they wrote debts that are due in US dollars. And when those debts come due, it is incredibly painful for China to experience. They're going through it right now. Right? I mean, just look at the property developers. They have a hell of a time trying to come up with the dollars they need to pay for their dollar-denominated debt, which is the most important part of their balance sheet when it comes to paying back debt. If they don't pay back the dollar-denominated debt, the rest of their credit rating goes to shit. Bad. Really bad. And this is what they're facing right now. All right. Let's cruise up here a little bit. All right. Okay. I remember the day you stopped watching content. I was there. I'd usually ask you, but I'll give it a shot. Percentage go lower? What, as far as interest rates? Yeah, they're going to go lower. All right, regurgitating stuff. Yeah. You are smarter than Peter Schiff. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily smarter than Peter Schiff. I just look at it much differently because Peter Schiff, and I don't mean to criticize or anything else. I have mad respect for Peter Schiff. He came on my show. He did an hour interview, gave me probably one of the best interviews out of everybody that I've ever interviewed. Peter Schiff was so gracious to give me an hour of his time, which I can't imagine how much that's worth. Like, it's worth more than a year of my time. So thank you, Peter, for doing that. Now, the only pushback that I have against Peter's information is that he's a gold salesman, right? Like, I know I'm a salesman too. I recognize the tactics, right? He's a gold salesman. He will never, ever, ever present any kind of information that is going to lead you to another direction outside of that of purchasing gold, because he's a gold salesman. That's his job. That's the whole point of everything that he is doing, right? Is to be in that position to sell. And he sells in a grand fashion. I mean, gets all the way up in front of Congress to do this selling. And it's incredible that he can actually do this on this such a level, right? And he's good at it. He's really good. And now when I say that, most of the information that I have learned throughout the years, learning about the economy, the Federal Reserve, and everything else, I learned from Peter Schiff. Watching Peter Schiff, listening to Peter Schiff, he was by far my number one most influential economist out there. Right? But again, like, I don't agree with a lot of things that he says because I understand the position that he's from. Like, his job is a particular job, and that's a salesman, and he's good at it. He's really, really good at it. You know, it doesn't take away from his information. The nuggets of information that he presents is outstanding, like outstanding stuff. The meaning that you give it is going to be questionable depending on how it is that you're receiving that information. Right? That, I think, is going to be, questionable for a lot of people out there. Much like Alex Jones was really good at delivering information, right? But the meaning that he put behind it was such fear-mongering scare tactics that people really couldn't use that information in any kind of helpful manner. Because most of the time, it just put them in a paranoid state, which is fear, and fear is not a way that you can progress through life in. So, it's unfortunate. I mean, I was an Alex Jones fan for a long time because he did have a lot of good information, but I couldn't stand the way that he was presenting it in such a way that, because it sold, it made money. Right. And again, he was like, a businessman trying to make money. And that's how you do it, is by blasting it out there in such a fearful way that you can get this huge following of people who are addicted to that sort of feeling that they get when they listen to the information. They want to be scared. It's like something internal that makes them feel like drawn to it. It's like attracted to it. All right. Schiff has the same problem I do, too pessimistic. I agree. There's a lot of pessimism out there in the world. Excellent. Schiff finally admitted he wish he had bought Bitcoin on Natalie's show. Well, he was on my show, and I told him that I buy Bitcoin, and I guess he says, well, I guess if you don't mind losing money. I mean, that's his direct statement to me on my show in an interview that I did with him, right? Because he was going off saying Bitcoin was a horrible deal, and I said, yeah, I buy Bitcoin. And he says, well, I guess if you don't mind losing money. That's exactly what he told me. And I'm thinking right now, it's just like, it's pretty good. I mean, I don't know. It's doing pretty good for me right now, bro. Peter was good when he was talking to people down at the Occupy Wall Street stuff. Yeah, I agree. I like that, when he was down there talking that too. I enjoy and appreciate the content you make. Thank you. Well, I thank you too. I mean, this isn't easy to do this every single day, to come out here and blast this information. And I'm down to the point now that I don't even need, I got my computer in front of me, but it's not even on. I keep turning it on, but it's dying because the battery's almost dead. But I don't need any of the stuff anymore. The theory and the information that I now have developed and built over the last few years, this is locked in. I can't change it. People are like, no, you got to look at it as, this other fashion. And I'm like, I can't. I've already taken in that idea, right? Absorbed the thought of how that would operate within my theories, and then realized my theories are not superior, but my conclusions that I come to them is that that is not the accurate form of thinking, right? And so I see this a lot. I mean, especially the number one thing that I think most people have a misunderstanding, the biggest misunderstanding within the economy right now, is that there's two of them. One, that the Federal Reserve didn't want inflation. They did very much. They wanted inflation. They needed it to fix their monetary policy. And then the other one is that they're attempting to go for a 2% target. And between these two things, most people have, literally 99% of the people have misunderstood the economy and misunderstood the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. And because they have misunderstood it, they have not been able to make appropriate and accurate positionings for themselves. Now, I'm not saying they did wrong. There's people who, no, I positioned myself and I made a bunch of money off of it. You're wrong, right? That's not what I'm trying to say, right? I'm not trying to say that at all. Many people can be able to position themselves to make a bunch of money even if they got the information wrong, right? I mean, how is it you were right but for the wrong reasons, right? That sort of thing can happen a lot, right? You can be right for the wrong reasons. And so just because you made a bunch of money off of it, or even if even with me saying, hey, I got the lumber thing right, and everybody else was wrong, and so I'm right about the economy. Well, I got one thing right as far as a commodity goes. People can say that, but in my opinion, no, it's not just that one commodity, right? I was talking about lumber, I was talking about silver, talking about oil, and all these things are sitting under their all-time highs by a dramatic amount. And so it's not just lumber that I was referring to. There's a lot of things within the economy. So again, the meaning that I give it and the meaning that other people give it is going to be so much different. But ultimately, understanding this stuff for yourself is going to be the only way that you can deal with it. And if you're pessimistic about the whole thing, it's going to be very hard to position yourself in a way that is going to be beneficial, right? Because everything is negative and it's not going to work and it's all going to fall apart and all this other stuff. So, all right. I enjoy and appreciate the content. Thank you. Okay, it takes a certain psychology that seems to be rare to accept information, wanting the truth versus confirming a present bias or manipulation of another for gain. Yeah, and that is the struggle, because I find that all the time within my own channel is people like ask me questions, they want a definite answer. How do I make money with this information? How do I, whatever. They have like all this definite, and I'm thinking, well, each and every single person is going to be different. Like how it is that I communicate with everything that I got going on out there is differently from what the other people are doing, right? So how you make money is going to be different from how I make money, because I make money through communication. Other people make money through physical labor, right? These are not going to be the same decisions that we make in our life for what it is that we want and what it is that we're going to do. So when we say, how do we make money with it? I'm like, well, I'm making money with it because I'm a communicator. How do you make money with it? Well, you might be in a physical labor, so you need to figure out how to translate this information into what it is that you're doing. I think Bitcoin started off as it started off as good, but now it's controlled, same thing as gold manipulated. People are too pessimistic. We're hoping to start a lumber mill. I know it's not great, but you never know. Lynn's thesis has been fiscal dominance for a couple of years. Monetary policy has taken a back seat. Well, I think she's right. Like, when it comes to the actual spending of money within the economy, there was a time when monetary policy was the way that spending within the economy would take place. But after hitting the lower bound of zero, that doesn't work anymore. And that's why it comes into more in fiscal policy, where the government, and I've said this how many times, like you don't spend the money anymore, so now the government borrows it and forces it into the economy, whether it's through stimulus checks or government programs or something like that. I've stated that many times. Like, I agree on that. Like, there's no difference inside of it. The difference that I think is probably going to end up taking place is that the Federal Reserve wanted an inflationary scenario. And I don't believe that most people out there, when it comes to economists, especially those who look negatively upon the Fed, know that or agree with that. Like, they just don't believe that at all, because the Federal Reserve never really stated it outside of John Williams' speech, talking about how the problem that they needed to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. That statement is pretty much only in that speech. There's like, I can't really find it anywhere else. Now, they do communicate in a way that does, confirm that, right? But it's not something that is outwardly stated. Not from Jerome Powell, not from Bowman, not from any of these other people, but it is in that speech coming from John Williams. And it is very important to internalize and understand that, because shortly after that speech, we started having massive inflation. And what do we get from the massive inflation? The Fed funds rate moved up to 5.5%. Wow, these are all the things that the Federal Reserve was looking for. They needed these things within their system in order to have their monetary policy come to a position in which that they could use it as an effective tool. And it's not even the adjustment of the rates that's the effective tool, it's the threat of adjusting rates that's the effective tool. But you can't threaten people with adjustment of rates if the rate is at zero. It doesn't work. Even if it's close to zero, it doesn't work. But if it's well above zero, up at 5.5%, now you can use credible threats to manipulate the market's perception of what it is that the Federal Reserve is planning on doing going into the future. And that is the effective tool for the economy. Nobody talks about it like that. I'm the only one. Right? And I got proof of how it is that they have developed this communication style. There's a speech that literally talks directly about this communication, not talking about the monetary policy adjustment through the Fed funds rates and how that impacts the banking system and all that. No, it doesn't talk anything about that. They talk directly about how it is that they have developed a communication system in order to deliver the information to the markets to best then conduct themselves so that it would fit in with what it is that the Federal Reserve wants for their monetary policy. Like, I can't communicate that anymore. It is so, I don't even know how to put it, like, so far out there from what most people even know or think about when it comes to monetary policy strategies, that I feel like I am the only one who knows about credible threats, who explains credible threats and uses credible threats into my strategy. Like, you see it out there. You'll find the articles when it comes up. They'll talk about the Fed signaling of the next rate cuts, but they don't incorporate that into being the main monetary policy tool. They talk about the signaling of the rate cuts and then focus in on the rate cut. And I'm thinking, damn, man, you just missed it. It's the signaling that's the important part, right? But since they don't really focus in on that, they just focus in, and it's just like, well, they signal it. Now here come the rate cuts. What's going to happen? And it's like, no, it's already happening. It's happening right now, right? It's happening right now because they signaled it. And once they signal it, it begins. Once the rate cut actually occurs, nothing happens. Everybody's already positioned by that point, right? So it doesn't have any impact on the economy. Not that by that point, because it's already happened. Right? And then the real impact, I mean, I should say on the markets, the real impact doesn't happen for another 6 months to a year. And so I don't know how many other people will communicate monetary policy in this way. I don't think anybody can, because nobody else has really developed the understanding of the monetary policy through direct speeches of the Federal Reserve to figure this thing out. Most people are sitting in a position in which that they are looking at the Federal Reserve as making a mistake. All right, like they don't know what they're doing. They made a mistake. They're playing on the seat. They're flying on the seat of their pants. All these things. Like, if you were taking in this as the consideration for what the Federal Reserve is doing, then you don't see the monetary policy in the fashion that not only I do from the Fed's own statements, but the way the Federal Reserve is looking at it. Because most people who are taking in that consideration that the Fed screwed up and that they are causing inflation to run rampant and they can't get control of it or whatever, actually benefited the Federal Reserve. That feeling of inflationary expectations that you were having that the Federal Reserve failed benefited the Federal Reserve. And everybody who communicated out there that the Federal Reserve was causing inflation and going to cause a hyperinflation scenario absolutely enhanced the ability for the Federal Reserve to get their monetary policy back. They actually were working in conjunction with the Federal Reserve wanted. Right? I'm one of the few people out there who said, don't believe this. Don't fall for this inflationary scenario. Right? Follow lumber, watch what lumber does. It's at an all-time high. You're going to see it go back down to normal, and people are going to be questioning why it's at its normal price. And yet here we are just barely moving into quantitative tightening. We are in that position now. People still scratching their head, can't figure it out. And so being one of the few people out here that was just like, hey, I called that, right? I mean, while everybody else was pointing at lumber saying this is what happens when the money printer goes off, and I'm one of the few people who are saying you're all going to be wrong. Every one of you are going to be wrong if you're calling on lumber being the hyperinflationary scenario coming from the Federal Reserve's money printer. If you are saying that right now, you will be wrong. And everybody was saying it. Like, I'm the only one who wasn't. Like, the one dude who was in lumber, who was looking at it, who, like everybody else, there was people out there who were making all kinds of lumber videos that were just absolutely killing it out there on the internet, on YouTube, presenting information that was completely wrong. Right? I mean, it was fear-mongering information, so I get why it was so popular, but the information was completely inaccurate in every way. Right? And so, again, like, I'm not falling for other people's, misunderstanding of the economy. Like, if I'm misunderstanding the economy, then I'm misunderstanding it. Like, I'm misunderstanding it on my own information of what it is that I've gathered. And since I've gathered directly from the Federal Reserve and I have the documents right here in front of me that I can pull up, then I'm good with my position. I don't deviate from it. You guys follow me on this channel for any length of time. You have known that I don't deviate much from my position on this. All right? It has been this way for months and years, even before, It was just like, I've been a strong dollar theorist for a very long time, believing that the dollar is only going to get stronger going into the future. And we are seeing that taking place, not necessarily here in the United States with purchasing power, but when we compare it to the basket of world currencies on the US dollar index, we are doing quite well. And in considering, again, like how many nations out there who have written debts that are due in dollars, and it's not even nations, it's corporations, it's people, it's all kinds of entities out there that have written debts that are due in dollars. When these debts come due, how the Federal Reserve is going to be able to provide the world with the liquidity that they need to pay off all those debts is going to be mind-blowing. Right? It's going to cause the dollar to be so strong, it'd make people head spin. They won't even understand why it's occurring, because they don't realize how much dollar-denominated debt actually exists in the world. Right? Nobody knows. The Fed doesn't even know. right? It's a complete assumption at this point, because when two people are writing debts that are due in dollars, it doesn't mean that they have to go and tell people about it. Right? And so just not even understanding how much is actually written out there is a very scary position for, I would feel, a lot of people who are trying to make sure that there's plenty of liquidity out there so we don't have a frozen banking system. I think that keeps them up at night. I really do. Yeah. Alrighty, guys, we're moving on to 2 hours, and I'm going to call it quits here because my wife's going to be home any minute now. All right, all debt is to be paid in U.S. dollar, foreign, and domestic. Do you think there will be a mini belt of hyperinflation in the near future? I don't think there's going to be hyperinflation in the United States. No. No, the only time hyperinflation will occur in the United States, when or if we have absolutely moved through the debt, right? Through all this dollar denominated debt. Once it is paid off and not rolled over into new debt, there's going to be cash that needs to go somewhere, and it'll go back to the United States. At that point, then you could see a hyperinflation scenario. But that is not even in the realms of possibilities right now. Like, I don't even see that as a far off concept. Like, that doesn't exist in my mind. But I do see how that could occur, but it's not going to. So until you find that people are actually not writing debts due in dollars, and even though you're going to find people, oh, the BRICS nations, whatever. Okay, China just wrote debts due in dollars. They wrote like $40 billion worth of debts that are due in dollars. I forget exact number. You can look it up. It may be a different number than that. But they just wrote a lot of offshore dollar-denominated debt, meaning that this is China government writing bonds that are due in dollars. They sell them in dollars, they're due in dollars, they don't have anything to do with the United States. This is occurring right now. This is not them getting out of dollars, this is them getting into dollars. And at some point in the future, they're going to have to get into more dollars in order to pay those bonds back. Brazil has done this, South Africa has done this, right? There is all these nations out there who are participating in the dollar system because there's really nothing else out there to use outside of the dollar. Not to the level and the extent that the dollar is doing it. And so even though you have nations who are trying to get together to try and say, hey, man, we don't want to do the dollar deal anymore, they're still doing them. They're still doing them because they have no other choice. And that's important to know. All right. Sorry if this is a bad question. There are no bad questions. How do interest rates affect gold and silver prices? Do tariffs also have an effect? Well, absolutely. Like, everything is going to have an effect. Uneducated engineer, I love the name. Everything is going to have an effect, but I think what you're probably looking for is a direct effect, and that's not the way it's going to end up going down, right? So you have to think, like, what is it that gold means for other people and for the reasons that they would end up buying them, right? Now, if you have things of like safe haven purchases or something of that nature, then you would find that a lot of people might be moving into gold in order to acquire that safe haven position. Like, they're worried about their own sovereign nation, they're worried about stock market, worried about real estate, whatever. They get into gold because then they don't have to worry about anything outside of the third party claim. That is a position that people take on a kind of a minor scale. Like, they'll allocate like 10% of their portfolio to gold or something of that nature. So it's not like a bunch of people are diving into that. When I think about interest rates coming down and whether or not that sparks business activity, well, whether or not people are worried about interest rates coming down being like a recessionary indicator and that the central bank is trying to create a stimulating effect within the economy, a lot of times the lowering of interest rates will scare people, right? This again will spark off that move into gold and silver. Well, if you have lower interest rates and this move into gold and silver, all of a sudden the miners are in a better position to borrow money and start doing business activity. Well, then you can find that the miners start doing well in this sort of environment with the lesser interest rates and the move into gold, right? So, like, again, like how, like, all these different ways of looking at it is really like, I mean, what position do you want to take? Like, I'm not into miners, I just want to be in the gold position. And it was just like, well, do you look at it as the safe haven, or are you looking at it as, like, as something that is going to be more in desired because of the industrial use of it, or is it going to be, Like you got so many what ifs that come from it. I don't look at interest rate adjustments in gold prices on the same thing. Like I don't look at these two being the same thing. Like I don't correlate those two together. Other people like they want to. They're like, hey, I want interest rates to correlate to gold so I know where to position. And I don't know if that's necessarily an accurate way of looking at it. Anyway, my wife's home. I'm going to go hang out with her. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know. Thank you very much for watching. It's been a great live stream. We're out here for 2 hours with 126 people watching and 108 thumbs up. Go hit that thumbs up button before we end the video here. By hitting that thumbs up button, the algorithm will pick up the video, spread it around, and we can come back in here and have some more discussion within the comment section after the video is uploaded. Thank you very much for being here on Uneducated Economist. You let me know.